Good evening. If you could please take your seats. We don't want to make our incredible panel wait too long, right? We have at least 10 minutes or so to get to the topic of tonight. Good evening, everyone. My name is Farshad Rafi. I'm the Executive VP of Sinai Temple Men's Club. As many of you know, actually I'm standing for the President of Men's Club, Michael Silverstein, who is continuing with his treatment, doing well. I just spoke with him. He sends his love and he says he's missing you. And he's doing very well, actually. An IDF friend of his actually called him Kadima. Do you know what that means? Moving forward, and that is the spirit that Michael has. So continue to send him your well wishes. Call him, go see him. So tonight is a monthly meeting of Sinai Men's Club. Every first Tuesday we have these incredibly educational events. We have many other activities. One of the major ones, we have an annual gala, Burning Bush, whereby we honor some members of the community and raise funds for a worthy cause. This year is on April 7th. If you don't know about it, contact one of us and we'll tell you about it. We do a lot of activities that have to do with mentoring the millennial generation for their careers and ambitions, and a lot of activities on the social front. Men's Club is a major contributor to the really broad activities on the social front that the synagogue has. And in fact, in connection with that, I want to invite Rabbi Rothenberg to just take a minute to tell you about a few of these.
Hello, everybody. On behalf of the Social Action Committee, I wanted to invite you to a few events we are doing between now and May. So you'll see on the back table there are two flyers. This one is our Packing with Purpose flyer. You'll see the dates that we are going to be packing bags for different organizations. And April is our Social Action Month. It's the first time as a synagogue that we're making 1 month dedicated synagogue-wide to having weekly social action opportunities. So you'll see the flyers on the back table. Please come join us. We would love you to be a part of it.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. And I actually want to recognize Shimon Ben Purat, who is a member of the Men's Club Executive Committee and our representative in the Social Action Committee. So anyway, I just want to make a quick pitch for you to join Men's Club if you're not already members. Men's Club in name only, it's men's and women's, as you can see. In fact, even more women than men participate and actually join. So please join. James Hatami with the red kippah there is in charge of our membership, and it costs only $75. You get one dinner a month. So that alone pays for it. So please join, become active, suggest activities that you would like the Men's Club to sponsor. We're already pretty active, but we'd like to do more. Our next month's meeting, the meetings are always on the first Tuesday of the month, is a lecture presentation called Identifying and Nurturing Gifted Children. It's by an expert in the field, Charlene Anderson. It's of interest to parents, grandparents, teachers, anybody who knows a gifted person and would like to help develop that person's potential. Grandchildren, all grandchildren are gifted, that's right, that's right. I forgot about that, especially if they're Jewish. All right, I would like to ask Eli to come and give us the Devar Torah for this evening.
Erev Tov and Chodesh Tov. As we journey through time, experiencing the adventures of our forefathers, as they left Egypt toward the Promised Land, we learn about what kind of people we are to become. I would like to take you back to those times and attempt to show how revolutionary and uncommon 13 of the rules were. Obviously, different people will come up with different lists because of the enormity of the transformation, and I'll make it very quick. I know I have a very short period of time to do this. Number one, sanctity of time. Places were holy, but no other culture of that period considered time holy. Think about Shabbat. Number two, the concept of the Shabbat as a day of rest. It has been shown experimentally that if workers are given breaks, productivity improves. The notion of a week and Shabbat is revolutionary. There's nothing in nature that points to a week. We can identify easily days, months, seasons, and years, but not the week. This is why on cruises, it is not unusual to see mats in elevators identifying the day of the week. The ancient Persians had different names for every day of the month. And on the day that the name of the month and the name of the day coincided, there would be a celebration. Think about the holiday of Maragon, for those who are familiar with that. Number three, sanctity of life. Unlike extant cultures, we were bidden not to sacrifice humans. The binding of Isaac is not an exception, but the proof of this. Number four, dignity of all humans. In a society where slavery was common, we were bidden to release slaves after 6 years of work. 6-year maximum is revolutionary when you consider that even our founding fathers had slaves. Number five, unity of God. Pantheons and idols were common. Judaism solved the need to have two gods for good and evil, as the ancient Persians did, Ahur Mazda and Ahriman, God of light and darkness, good and evil. Man, the partner, was given the choice to do good or evil. 6, partnership of God and man. We are Israel, one who struggles with God. Jacob fought the angel. Abraham negotiated with God to save Sodom. Moses dialogued with God not to destroy the Jewish people. 7, equal and fair treatment. In the Code of Hammurabi, you were treated differently if you stole the sheep of a neighbor or that of a king. You would die for the second. In Judaism, the judges are bidden not to favor the poor for being poor, nor favor the rich for being rich. 8, measure for measure. The punishment suits the crime. Do not cut off the hand of the person who stole a loaf of bread. The perpetrator's punishment is to return 2 loaves of bread. One that he stole, and the other as a punishment for what he wanted to do to another. 9, death caused by accident. Families had the right to avenge death, but if judges determined that the death was accidental, the perpetrator was sent to sanctuary cities, Arei Miklat, to live out the rest of their lives, and they could not be touched. 10, treatment of the stranger, widow, orphan, deaf, and the blind. 36 times references to the treatment of the strangers is well known. Do not put an obstacle in the way of the blind. 11, leaders can be flawed, and the flawed can be leaders. Many of our leaders were flawed. The greatest leader, Moses, the stutterer, was not deemed worthy to reach the Promised Land. King David was not allowed to build a temple. 12, a strong system of checks and balances in leadership. The king versus the prophet. Samuel removes Saul as a king. The prophet Nathan admonishes David for his treatment of Uriah. Finally, number 3, you serve God when you serve people. Following the momentous revelation of the Ten Commandments, the first laws were not about how one should worship God, but how to treat another human being. This is the way to serve God. Much of these revolutionary changes have become part and parcel of the modern world. It makes me proud to be part of this ancient revolutionary religion.
Thank you, Eli. Most of you do know Eli. For those who don't, Eli is the past president of Men's Club, one of the most active members of the temple, and a true guide and mentor to those of us who have joined his efforts here. Thank you, Eli. And a lot of the points he made are very much related to what we are going to be talking about tonight. So, without further ado, let's move on to what you have come here to hear. Our panel tonight consists of, first and foremost, Rabbi David Wolpe. For the few years that I have come here, every time he's appeared on this podium, first of all, we have drawn huge crowds, and secondly, the introducer has said Rabbi Wolpe does not need an introduction. And that is indeed the case, so I will not tell you what you probably already know about him, other than the fact that from a men's club point of view, we're incredibly indebted to Rabbi Wolpe for his sharing of his time generously with us, joining us every time we have asked him, despite the schedule that you can all imagine how packed it is. So, Rabbi, thank you. Thank you for being here. Our first panelist is Mr. Jonathan Neumann, who is here all the way from the UK. I hope you have other visits in the US as well, but we're really indebted for you to come here. As soon as we contacted Jonathan after we had read a review of his book, he agreed to come, and he's finally here. Jonathan is an author, a scholar. He has studied at Cambridge University and London School of Economics. He was the Tikva Fellow at Commentary Magazine and assistant editor at Jewish Ideas Daily. He has long been involved in campaigns against BDS on college campuses and in Jewish education, particularly for college students. He's the author of the book, To Heal the World, How the Jewish Left Corrupts Judaism and Endangers Israel, a strong critic of U.S. liberal Judaism, as we shall see, which gave rise, in fact, to today's event. We are very happy you're here, Jonathan. Our third panelist is Rabbi Sharon Brous. I have to share a secret with you. I have personally been after Rabbi Brous for the past year and a half to get her to come and talk to us, and having reviewed her bio and realizing how active she is, I know why it's so difficult to get commitments from her, but we finally broke through her resistance. She's here. Rabbi Brous is the senior rabbi and founding rabbi of IKAR, with the goal, an organization with the goal of reinvigorating Jewish practice and inspiring people of faith to reclaim a moral and prophetic voice. IKAR has become one of the fastest growing and most influential Jewish congregations in the country. It was founded in 2004, I believe, and has grown very quickly. today is credited with sparking a rethinking of religious life at a time of unprecedented disaffection and declining affiliation with religion. Rabbi Brous's 2016 TED Talk, Reclaiming Religion, has been viewed by more than 1.3 million people. Probably that number is surpassed now, and translated into 20 languages. In 2013, she blessed President Obama and Vice President Biden at the inaugural National Prayer Service, and Mayor Eric Garcetti at his inauguration in LA in 2017. And she sits now on the Mayor's Interfaith Collective. She spoke at the Women's March in Washington, D.C. in 2017. She's been named #1 on the Newsweek and Daily Beast list of the most influential rabbis in America, and she has been recognized by the Forward and the Jerusalem Post as one of the 50 most influential Jews. She's a graduate of Columbia University, was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary. She lives in LA with her husband David and her 3 kids, who I believe attend Sinai Kibbutz. Welcome.
So thank you to our guests and to all of you for coming tonight. The ground rules are pretty simple. At the end of the evening, we're going to take a vote, and all of your money will either go to the ACLU or the Heritage Foundation, depending on what you decide. You'll notice, you probably can't tell, but my chair is exactly equidistant between our 2 participants, and my sympathies will be revealed in asking them both as difficult questions as I can, and then of course we will open it up to you. But I've asked both of our participants if they will begin with a few minutes presentation, and so appropriately on my right, we're going to begin with Jonathan Neumann.
Thank you, Rabbi Wolpe, and thank you to the Men's Club and the Synagogue for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I thought in the few minutes that I have, it may be worth me telling you why I wrote this book, To Heal the World, which will also be available for purchase at the end of this discussion. There were 3 main reasons, and I'll begin with a brief story. I was at the house some years ago of a friend of mine who is very involved in the youth movement of her progressive denomination, and I just noticed on her fridge a bulletin from either the denomination or the synagogue that made some reference to Tikkun Olam. And I turned to her and I said, you know, this is almost certainly complete nonsense. And I then started saying this to more people as noticed the phrase coming up, and eventually people started saying to me, well, you know, justify yourself, elaborate. So I wrote a short essay about how the way that we understand Tikkun Olam today is not how it is portrayed or understood in the Jewish sources or in the Jewish tradition. There really isn't any connection between Tikkun Olam and the Jewish tradition and how we understand it today. And I then went on to write the book for an additional 2 reasons. So one was that distortion of Judaism, a distortion of the Jewish sources. The other 2 were, firstly, that I wondered whether there was a connection between the commitment to Tikkun Olam on the part of certain denominations, particularly in American Jewry, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, rampant levels of assimilation amongst those denominations that seem to be most committed to Tikkun Olam. And I was wondering whether there was a connection between those 2 phenomena. And the third reason was what I saw as hostility toward Israel emanating from the Tikkun Olam movement. And in the course of looking at this and exploring this, I realized that although not every Jewish organization that is either critical of Israel or even downright hostile towards Israel and even its existence. Not every such organization cites social justice or Tikkun Olam as a motivation, but every Jewish organization that cites Tikkun Olam or social justice as a motivation is either critical toward Israel or further down the line, downright hostile to Israel's existence. And again, that was something that I wanted, a connection that I wanted to explore. So very briefly, the argument of the book is as follows. Number one, Tikkun Olam is hegemonic in American Judaism. It is there from cradle to grave. It's there in books for infants, in elementary school and high school curricula, extracurricular activities, summer camps, campus initiatives. The Great American Philanthropies are dedicated to Tikkun Olam. There are countless books and journals. You hear it from pulpits. It's everywhere, from cradle to grave. The polls show that American Jews are overwhelmingly interested in Tikkun Olam or committed to it in some form or other. The great denominations of American Jewry are committed to Tikkun Olam, and so on. It's even American Judaism's greatest export. Even presidents talk about Tikkun Olam. It's widely recognized in the Jewish and even in the non-Jewish community. So that's number one. Tikkun Olam is hegemonic. Number two, Tikkun Olam in contemporary usage means social justice. I think that's a general, I think that's an easy way of expressing it. And social justice has, and Tikkun Olam have an opinion on every issue in American political discourse. And this comes on to point number three, that their opinion on every issue in American political discourse is liberal. So the third point is, what is social justice? Social justice is left-wing politics. Now, whatever you may think social justice should be, whatever you would like it to be, what it is in reality is left-wing politics. And that's not a judgment. It can be left-wing, they can be right-wing, but if we look at Tikkun Olam, we look at social justice, these are what they are. And just think to yourself, who are the politicians who talk about Tikkun Olam or social justice? Who are the politicians who don't? Think of the issues that you think about, the political ideas that you think about when you hear the term social justice and Tikkun Olam. I suspect that things like fracking and being pro-life are not among them. It's important, and this is one of the most important things I think that I'm going to say this evening. It is vital to differentiate between left-wing politics, social justice rather, and charity. Social justice and charity are two different things. Social justice is a political ideology. Charity, grassroots activism, volunteerism, and such localized efforts are sometimes subsumed within the rubric of social justice, but they are distinct, and that's something that we can go into a bit later if you'd like. So, we've had number one, Tikkun Olam is hegemonic in American Judaism. Number two, Tikkun Olam means social justice. Number three, social justice is left-wing politics. Number four, Tikkun Olam is Jewish social justice. So what is Jewish social justice? Jewish social justice is exactly the same as normal social justice, except there is the idea that the left-wing politics of social justice are endorsed by and mandated by Judaism. Mandated by the biblical and rabbinic texts. That is the claim of the Tikkun Olam movement, and the sorts of sources that they point to are the creation of the world, the creation of man in the image of God, Joseph's economic policies in Egypt, the Exodus, the books of the prophets, and of course the appearances of Tikkun Olam in rabbinic writings. Number five, finally, is why Tikkun Olam is bad for the Jews. So the first thing is, as we said, this distortion of the sources. Tikkun Olam is not Judaism. Number two, Tikkun Olam is a stridently universalistic idea. There is an underlying theology to Tikkun Olam. It is stridently universalistic, and it has no real place for the Jewish people. It can't really explain why the Jewish people needs to persist. And if there's no need for a Jewish people, then, and this is the final reason why Tikkun Olam is bad for Jews, if there's no need for a Jewish people, there's also no need for a Jewish state in the ancient Jewish homeland. And that is the kind of theological connection of why Tikkun Olam has an Israel problem.
Thank you. Rabbi Brous.
So, thank you. Thank you for having me here tonight, and thank you for the incredible persistence in trying to get me here. I know that it did take a while. And I just want to say, earlier it was mentioned that 2 of our 3 kids go to school here and love it very much. And that's not my only connection to Sinai Temple. Also, we're in a kind of rabbinic marriage with Sinai Temple because your great Rabbi Sam Rotenberg is married to our great Rabbi Kayla LaBelle, and so we share many things. So I say that to say that we are among family tonight. So I am sure that as in all families, we might disagree vociferously, and I hope we can do so as loving family members would. Okay. So I am grateful for the opportunity to sit here with my friend Rabbi Wolpe and okay. So I read Jonathan's book quite carefully and have spent now the past several weeks really thinking about the ideas that you raised here, and most importantly, why such a book would be written. And what the driver is and what the virtue or value is of such a work in the world, given where we are today and given what really the great threats are facing the Jewish people and facing us as Americans, facing the world. And so I hope that we'll be able to unpack that a little bit, and I'm left feeling very curious to try to understand more about what has driven you here. I can tell you that for me, many years ago, I read about some studies that were put together by a couple of psychologists at Emory University, and they were trying to understand children's emotional health. And they ended up developing a certain scale that they called the Do You Know scale, where they would ask children 20 questions. Do you know how your parents met? Do you know what town your grandparents grew up in? Do you know the names of all of your great-grandparents, etc.? Do you know if any of your parents had an injury before you were born, a physical injury? And they realized that there was a direct correlation between children who knew their family stories and emotional health, resilience, and ability to get along well. Even those kids even did better in school, they found. And they weren't always because the stories were good stories. Sometimes they were triumph and success stories, and sometimes they were stories of real hardship. And what they found was that there's something about the power of telling stories from one generation to the next that builds within us a certain sense of purpose and a certain kind of directionality to history. When I read about this, I realized that this is true not only in our immediate families, and think about the practice that many of us have of naming our children after beloved grandparents or those who came before who have passed away, because we want to make sure that they not only carry the name, but hear the stories and carry the echoes of their presence in the world. But this is true not only of families, but it's also true of communities, of religious communities. There are stories that we tell, and we tell them from generation to generation, and when those stories are told, we build a kind of resilience and a kind of emotional health and sense of purpose within our communities. As Jews, we tell a lot of stories, but there's one particular story that we are completely consumed with as a people. That's the story that takes up 4 of the 5 books of our Torah. That is the story that we engage intensely and immersively every year when we come to Passover. It's the story that we recount when we come to Rosh Chodesh. It's the story that we remember when we say Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim every Friday night as we enter Shabbat. Traditional Jews recount this story 3 times every single day. That story that has primacy for us is the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And I began to wonder as I was learning about child psychology and what it means for children to grow up hearing a story, why our tradition has so centralized this particular story. And Jonathan writes a good bit about the way that social justice activists have tried to claim the story of the Exodus from Egypt as a kind of core, and central story for them, but it's actually not a liberal invention, and it's not a reform invention, with all respect to my reform colleagues. This is the centerpiece of biblical legislation, and it's the centerpiece of our liturgy as well. And it occurs to me that at the crux of this debate is perhaps why we tell this story and what we think we're doing when we obsessively recount this story day after day, year after year, over the course of now several thousand years. From my perspective, it is very clear that the centrality of the story of the Exodus from Egypt, of our people being oppressed and enslaved, for several hundred years, degraded by an oppressive, tyrannical ruler who had no care for the dignity of the human beings that lived under his rule, and instead lived in a fear-driven reality, only concerned that they might one day rise up above him and therefore oppress them in harsh and relentless ways. That the reason that we read the story of God entering human history in order to partner with those Israelite people and walk with them from slavery to freedom and from degradation to dignity is because this story is a paradigm for the human experience. This is not only something that happened only once in history, but something that every single person in this room has experienced in our own personal history. Something that our people have experienced again and again and again since the moment that we first left Egypt. And we are called to remember in our muscles, in our body, in our DNA, that our people were in slavery and then made our way toward freedom. And that such a journey is possible again. And that's the hope part of this story, that no matter how great the darkness, that light is in fact possible again. And number two, that if we live in a chapter of power, when we're already living in the promised land, and for some people, Los Angeles is frankly the promised land. If we're already living in a moment of great promise realized, then we need to remember that not everybody else is. And as those people who were enslaved in Egypt, we need to remember how bitter that slavery tasted and how nobody paid attention to us when we were suffering in that darkness. And therefore, Torah tells us, as it was already mentioned tonight, 36, and some people say 46 times, what our obligation is to the stranger. Completely disproportionate to any other mitzvah that we will read about in our Torah. And so to my mind, this is not some made-up 20th century invention of a bunch of feminists who wanted to eat pork, but instead it's really a core message of our tradition, which has for many years been at the beating heart of what our tradition calls us to place as central and calls us to realize. And in different chapters of our history, it has been at the forefront, and then it's receded, and then it's gone back to the forefront. That, to my mind, has more to do with power and powerlessness than it does with the real centrality of this core idea to the Jewish people.
So let me ask you both questions about your presentations first before you comment on each other's presentations. First of all, to you, Jonathan, since you went first, how much of this is honestly, strip away the words Tikkun Olam, because the words themselves are less important than the ideologies underneath it. How much of this is essentially really a battle between right and left, politically, religiously? So it's Orthodox versus liberal Judaism, the right wing or the Republican Party versus the left wing or the Democratic Party, because it seems to me that all the fault lines that we're talking about here could be pretty neatly, almost like this crowd, although not by ideology, by seating, could almost like very easily be put on the two sides. And the truth is that this is just an additional salvo in the battle that people use to call the other side illegitimate.
Thank you. That's a terrific question. I want to echo what Rabbi Brous said about this being these are debates for the sake of heaven, and absolutely these need to be had respectfully. And I think hopefully we can be an example of that this evening to the sorts of debates that we should be having in the Jewish community. So there are 2 points there. Is this just a rehash of kind of Orthodox versus non-Orthodox? And I think there is certainly an element of truth to that, but I don't think that the argument that I'm making is kind of coterminous with the Orthodox position. And I think that's borne out by the fact that there are plenty of non-Orthodox people who agree with my thesis. In fact, one of the most gratifying responses that I receive is when I speak, particularly to young audiences, but not only to young audiences, and I have people come to me after and say, thank you so much. I come from a non-Orthodox background, and I'm non-Orthodox, and thank you so much for giving me a voice, because I've had to sit through, services and sermons and so on in my temple growing up, all this time having to listen to this sort of thing, and it's driving me nuts. I either sit at the back quietly and say nothing and leave as soon as I can, or I've stopped going to temple or synagogue completely. So I don't think it's, just so simple to say that this is just kind of orthodox and non-orthodox, and in fact there are people in the orthodox community who don't agree with the thesis and who are in fact part of, you know, what I would call the Tikkun Olam movement. So I certainly think that there is an element of truth to what you're saying in that respect, but I don't think it's the entirety of it. And in terms of right and left, I think this is also important to put out now. I'm making the case in the book that Judaism is not synonymous with liberal politics in the contemporary United States, but I absolutely do not make the argument, and am not making the argument, that Judaism is synonymous with conservatism in the contemporary United States. And nowhere in the book do I argue that Judaism endorses every conservative position in contemporary political discourse. I don't make that argument because I don't believe it. Judaism is an ancient civilization. The idea that it can be aligned with any particular platform.
Would you be comfortable giving us an example of a conservative position that Judaism rejects?
Interestingly, I actually think that the real point is that Judaism doesn't have a position on most of the issues that occupy American political discourse today. You know, for some reason it's become controversial to suggest that perhaps the God of Israel doesn't really care about what the federal marginal tax rate is in the contemporary United States. I don't really understand why, you know, Judaism has to have a position on all these things. I think Judaism doesn't have a position on a lot of these things. I think there are very few actually political policy prescriptions that arise out of Judaism. So, you know, in brief, I would say that I don't think these things are aligned right and left. I think Judaism transcends the sort of political platforms that we have today, and it does an enormous disservice to ourselves, to our community, and to the young people in our community if this is what we're presenting Judaism as.
So, and to Rabbi Brous, I think you gave a very stirring presentation about why Judaism should care about the stranger. I didn't understand the substance of Jonathan's presentation, though, to be saying Judaism shouldn't care about the stranger, but rather that the Judaism of the left has become synonymous with all the platforms of the Democratic Party and shows a rapid rate of assimilation as opposed to the right, because there's been a substitution of politics for religious principles, and also less particularism, which tends to perpetuate the people, and universalism, which tends to allow people to disappear into the universal. So the question is, how much is that true? Do you see that on the left? And what in Tikkun Olam, or what in caring for the stranger, keeps people Jewish as opposed to keeping people caring for the stranger, which are not identical things? Because you can care for the stranger and be a Unitarian.
So I think there are a lot of straw men that are being set up throughout the book and throughout this argument, and I think it would help us a little bit to kind of separate out some issues here. I mean, for example, throughout the book, you cite very frequently the teachings of Rabbi Michael Lerner. And you then draw conclusions that that's essentially what those people who engage in justice work, ranging from people who are engaged in climate justice to working for hotel workers to get a living wage, to Jews who are on the street fighting against the shutting down of the borders and the asylum seekers being separated from their children, to all be reflective of this one particular rabbi's one particular views. And it feels to me that, I think it might be useful for us if we have a conversation to test some of those assumptions rather than work on the assumption that whatever one particular rabbi says reflects the way all Jews who care about and engage in social justice work actually feel. I think that would be a useful exercise for us, and I know that there are many people in this room who have dedicated their lives to social justice work who don't necessarily feel that our views are reflected by several of the people that you cite in the book, whose arguments, some of whose arguments might be easier to knock down than others, frankly. So that's the first thing that I want to say. But I didn't answer your question, Rabbi Wolpe, so can you tell me?
I noticed that, but I was
I'm not going to let myself off the hook so easily here.
So, well, look, I'll put it in two parts. One, and I certainly include the conservative movement as well as the reform movement together, there is a clear correlation between being on the left side of the religious movement and the political movement and assimilation, and statistics that show a certain disappearance, and how much of that is due to the fact that values can be universal, whereas ritual, study, texts, Hebrew prayer are particularistic. And second, allied to that, how easy is it for someone to be not Jewish and yet participate in essentially all of the things that many Jews consider valuable and important? And does it mandate any kind of real Jewish identity to fight for hotel workers, to care about asylum seekers, all the things that you just mentioned? Is there anything in that that is particularistically Jewish? And if not, then how do you persuade people to do it from a Jewish point of view?
So this is where I think that there's a straw man situation going on here. So there's a sense that if somebody believes in the universality of human dignity, for example, as a core principle that we derive from, I don't know, say the beginning of the book of Bereshit, the beginning of Genesis, when we learn that all human beings are created in the image of God. Or say from Sanhedrin, which I don't know if Mishnah Sanhedrin would fall under traditional Judaism the way that you describe it in the book, but it seems to me that it probably should, where we learn that all human beings, descendants of Adam.
You're making a quick switch. I just want to
I'm
point
making
that
a
out.
quick switch.
Well, I'm saying...
I'm coming back to you. I'm
Okay.
coming around. So what our Mishnah teaches and what our tradition teaches is that all human beings are created in the image of God, not only Jewish human beings. So those Jews who believe in and fight for universal human dignity are then therefore assumed to have completely given up on our particularist interests. That's the way that I read what you're arguing, and actually even just heard the question. In other words, there's an assumption that we live in this binary reality where you either are a particularist or you're a universalist. You're either a particularist who davens and learns Torah and cares about Israel, or you're a universalist who cares about hotel workers and fights the Trump administration and doesn't believe that children should be separated at the border. To my mind, that's an offensive claim on both fronts, because the Judaism that I live and the Jewish community that we have worked very hard to build here, and the Jewish social justice movement by and large, not in every case, is one that really honors a particular path to a universal end. And by the way, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the great radical, liberal Jonathan Sacks, is the first person who taught me that many years ago, that the way that we can achieve our universalist aspirations is by being the best Jews that we can be. And I would just argue that as we criticize Kojal and Chazon and PJA and Ben the Ark and all of these organizations that are mentioned in your book that are working to provide Jews, and in particular young Jews, with opportunities to manifest their core Jewish values in Jewish spaces, it's important to realize that those Jews are choosing to do this justice work with other Jews and in Jewish organizations and with Torah study at the beginning of the meeting or at the beginning of the rally. So they're making a choice to be attached to a particularist claim, whether it's some kind of tribalism, whether it's rooted in Talmud Torah, whether it's connected to their davening experience. So I've seen, both in the book and in many of the people who've written about your book, a kind of really reductionist claim that those who fight for universal rights have therefore abandoned our particular Jewish rituals, traditions, and peoplehood. And my answer to that is, come to IKAR and see how we daven and see how long Musaf is. Even though people are hungry for lunch, we have in no way abandoned our particular claims and have no intention to, because they're all part of one conversation for us. I believe that Jonathan Sacks was right, that the very best way to be a universalist is to be a particularist. And to answer your second question, I also believe, and the more work I do in multi-faith justice spaces, the more I believe this to be true, that we have very strong alliances with many siblings who are out there in the world, who call God by a different name, who daven in different ways than we do, and who study sacred text in different ways than we do, and share a lot of the same core values that we do. They are also children of God. They are also fighting for the dignity of children of God. And I go to shul on Saturday, they go to mosque on Friday, they go to church on Sunday, but we can actually align in fighting against poverty and fighting against people dying because they can't afford proper health care. And to my mind, that doesn't, by the way, to my mind and to Rabbi Jonathan Sachs's mind, that doesn't diminish my Jewish claims, that only enhances the greatness of God.
I still think my question wasn't answered.
Yeah, there's a huge amount to unpack there. I'll just say briefly on the straw man. There is some discussion of Michael Lerner in the book. One of the reasons for that is that Michael Lerner is a leading figure in the Jewish social justice movement. Michael Lerner has probably done more than anybody else to popularize the phrase Tikkun Olam. People don't really realize Tikkun Olam in its current usage is a very, very modern phenomenon. It really only goes back to the 1970s, 1980s. And Tikkun magazine was at the absolute forefront of popularizing this phrase. It doesn't really go back much more than that, far from being a kind of ancient idea. Its association with social justice is a very new phenomenon. But Michael Lerner occupies a very small portion of the book. There are other figures who occupy much larger portions. And to give you one example, Michael Walzer, and in particular Michael Walzer's treatment of the Exodus, which conveniently Rabbi Brous has rehearsed almost word for word in her presentation of a few moments ago, talking about the oppression that the Jews in Egypt is a paradigm for all time of the oppression by a tyrannic ruler over human beings. This may well be the case for non-Jews, and non-Jews are welcome to read the Bible as they will, and we can gain a great deal of inspiration from the fact that many positive movements in history, and some less positive, have drawn inspiration, particularly from the story of the Exodus. That's something that we can be very pleased about and gratified about, that our contribution to human civilization has been used in these positive ways. But when it comes to us, when it comes to the Jewish people, the story of the Exodus has a very particular meaning. It is not the story of a people, a collection of human beings who were oppressed by a tyrannic ruler and who moved from slavery to freedom. And it's not about a paradigm of power and powerlessness. It is the story of God's elect people, of the Jewish people, the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who were sent into slavery as prophesied by God to the patriarchs in Genesis. They were taken into slavery in Egypt, and God heard their cries, not because they were oppressed, or not merely because they were oppressed, and not because they were enslaved, because the Bible has no principled opposition to slavery, not because they were enslaved. God heard their cries because they were his chosen people, and because he had made promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that he would redeem his people from Egypt. That is the reason that we recount the story of the Exodus in such detail in Passover, why we recount it multiple times on a daily basis, and, as Rabbi Brous absolutely rightly said, it is so important because it is the centerpiece of Judaic legislation. And the reason for that is because the Exodus from Egypt culminates in Sinai, in the giving of the Torah, and in the reaffirmation of the covenant between the God of Israel and the people of Israel, and the laws of Israel emanate from that covenant. That is what the Exodus means to the Jewish people, and that is what we should be talking about on Passover, not about the meanings that it has to non-Jews. And what's extraordinary about the Jewish social justice movement, about the Tikkun Olam movement, is that when it comes to Passover, they seem to celebrate every meaning of the Exodus except the Jewish one.
Okay. Now, here is what frustrates me about both your positions. I'm going to ask each of you about your position first, John. First of all, that last phrase was an applause getter, but it was, I hope you will agree, a wild exaggeration. They don't celebrate every meaning except the Jewish one. And we ought to be careful about, what we say about our antagonists, even if it was a good line, don't get me wrong. I have a lot of appreciation for a good line, but what frustrates me about the position of the right in general is, I think from any reading of Jewish sources, it is impossible to look at the oppression of other people and not believe that the relieving of that oppression is a Jewish mission. It's just impossible. The recounting of because you were strangers in the land of Egypt over and over and over and over again is not trivial. And the Talmud itself talks about the fact that, as Rabbi Brous mentioned, 36 times, therefore stranger is mentioned. So you can say they have elevated that above other Jewish principles that should be equally important, or it has taken over from, but to not acknowledge the centrality of care, even outside of the Jewish tradition, for people who are oppressed, who are enslaved, who are belittled, who are poor, is, I think, to traduce the tradition and to make it, and to ensure that you can't be an Or Legoyim, a light to the nations, because how can you be a light to the nations if the nations think you're indifferent to them?
You'll get an applause for questions. Yeah, there's a lot there, and thank you for bringing that up. And again, a lot of this is stuff that is discussed in a lot more depth in the book, and there's only so much justice that one can do to it, I think, in the short time. But look, firstly, having care for non-Jews, and absolutely Jews need to be compassionate towards non-Jews, and that is in Jewish law. Absolutely, the Gentile naked need to be clothed, the Gentile homeless need to be sheltered, the Gentile hungry need to be fed. But care, compassion, charity, these are not politics. These are different from politics, and that's incredibly important. There is not a direct line from Judaism to particular policy prescriptions, and when people go out and say that Judaism mandates a certain form of politics, they are distorting what Judaism is about. Let me say something about universalism, because that's come up now a few times. Why does the Torah start at the creation of the world, the creation of humanity? To us, it seems obvious that the Torah should start there, but actually, why does the Torah start there? Why doesn't the Torah start, for example, with Abraham? Go for yourself to the land that I will show you. Why doesn't it start there? Or even Rashi, the great medieval commentator, asks on the first verse of Bereshit, the first verse of Genesis, why doesn't the Torah start even partway through the book of Exodus? Why does it start at the beginning? And I think one of the lessons we can take from it is actually that God tries twice to found a world society on universalistic morality, and twice it fails. He tries first with Adam, and 10 generations later it fails spectacularly with the flood. He tries again with Noah, and 10 generations later it fails with the Tower of Babel. And at that point, God's attention turns particularistic and turns to a particular nation, and pretty much the rest of the Torah and the Bible are concerned with this particular nation. In a sense, you almost get the impression that the particularism is an antidote to those failed universalistic models. And I think that's important and significant to point out, because it should be a warning to us for overemphasizing the universalism in Judaism. Judaism is above all a particularist faith. There's no question that there are elements of universalism in there. Absolutely, the Jews have to be compassionate towards the non-Jews. That's, as I said, that's brought down in Jewish law. But that is not the be-all and end-all of Judaism. And the idea that is routinely propagated that the foundation of Judaic morality is in the creation of all human beings in the image of God is not the case. The foundation of the source of obligation in traditionalist Judaism is the covenant at Sinai, the covenant between every Israelite and every other Israelite, and the people of Israel and the God of Israel. The creation of all human beings in the image of God is a very important Jewish teaching, without question, but it is secondary when it comes to moral obligation. Jews are obligated first and foremost to one another, just as family members are obligated first and foremost to one another. It would be very strange if you felt as obligated to support financially and emotionally a complete stranger or someone else in your community as you are to your own family. People would rightly find that strange. It is only natural that people feel obligated to their families. And similarly, the Jewish people is a family. We are all descendants of Abraham. There are other analogies as well that one can use. Nations, for example, where Americans are more obligated to fellow Americans than they are to people on the other side of the world. Again, because you can expect reciprocity from your fellow citizens. You're all bound by the same laws, and so on. Similarly, with Judaism, there's nothing controversial about that. So I think it's very important that the hierarchy of obligation is understood, and again, it's something I go into more detail in the book.
And what I want to point out, at least to me, about your position, Rabbi Brous, and it is true, by the way, that the halakha does say Jew before non-Jew, the poor of your own family, your own city before others, and all of that is true. It has that particularistic hierarchy. But it seems to me that you perform a sort of rhetorical jujitsu when I ask you about this. Because I say a lot of people who believe in universality as a result seem to move away from particularistic Judaism, and they think of the universality as the expression of their Judaism. And your answer to that is, look at all these particularistic Jews who are expressing universality, and isn't that a great thing? And yes, it is a great thing. And I am a big fan of what you do, and of IKAR, and of IKAR's approach to the world. I think it's fantastic, but I think that you're being not entirely forthcoming about what many people who join you, not necessarily in IKAR, but on the social justice bandwagon from the Jewish perspective, really what their Judaism consists of. And do you not see many, many Jews who think that their Judaism is essentially a social justice thing without any knowledge of Torah, without any prayer, without any particularism, without any fidelity to Israel, and they think that their Judaism is essentially coterminous with what is a social justice agenda? And doesn't that perplex or bother you, or don't you think that that's a problem, and hasn't he identified something real?
So of course there are Jews who connect to a social justice agenda and to nothing else. I don't believe that those are people who were living happily as Torah learned, mitzvah observing Jews, who then saw that there was an IKAR option, and they said, this is awesome, I can give up all the mitzvot and just go fight in the streets for the hotel workers and feel like a really good Jew. The reason that it feels like jujitsu to you is because I actually see it in the exact opposite direction. I believe that, first of all, a lot of Jews who've already walked away from observant engagement because they feel that the Jewish community and that Jewish practice is largely insular, judgmental, exclusive, ultra-nationalist, and really, frankly, out of alignment with where their values are in the world, is simply not a home for them, and would be therefore completely disengaged from Judaism, and then find that maybe there's a bend in the arc in their neighborhood or in their city, and they think, oh, I can actually connect with other young Jews who similarly care about the world, and then that's a point of access for them to get back involved in Jewish life. So I don't believe that people feel like they can leave their tefillin at the door because now they found a way to live a fulfilling Jewish life without it.
You don't think that there are people who present that as an option? Basically, this is what Judaism is, and a lot of people are more or less convinced that that's what...
It's not what I see. I mean, I live in this space. Of course there are people who engage in, whose Jewish identity manifests only in the work that in feeding the hungry. Personally, I would choose to spend my time, especially in a moment like the moment that we're living in today, not criticizing those people. Like this sweet woman who came up to me last weekend when I was doing a scholar in residence in Virginia, and she was so excited because she just finished doing a year of avodah, this service project that I'm sure you have strong feelings about, where it's a gap year program where young people go off into various cities and they get to study Torah and they get to go out and do some kind of justice project over the course of the year. And her eyes were wide, and she was full of excitement, and she said, I felt so deeply connected to my Judaism for the first time. And I thought, what would Jonathan Neumann say about that? And I realized...
What would Jonathan Neumann say?
He just wrote a book about it. I'll tell you what he said. I mean, so here's what I think. Would I love for this person to have a very rich and full Jewish life that includes showing up at Shiva even when it's inconvenient, that includes staying for Musaf even when she's hungry for lunch? that includes, that includes making certain choices about how she eats and what kind of words she says out loud, even when she's thinking that she wants to say something, maybe shmirat halashon, like not saying everything you want to say. Sure, but I'm not upset with her for doing a program that she feels introduced her to Jewish community, gave her access to Jewish text for the first time, to other young Jews doing something interesting, and gave her the opportunity to do something meaningful in the world for a year. I wouldn't write my book criticizing that woman. I feel like, great, now let's encourage her to take the next step in the door.
You want to respond to that?
No, I'm not done, but go ahead. I got a lot more to say.
Sure. Look, I'll say very briefly. You'll have obviously experience in this on a day-to-day basis. Certainly, empirically, there's very little evidence that social justice brings estranged Jews back to Judaism. If anything, the opposite seems to be true. That Jews who are already involved in Jewish life might be more likely to do either volunteering, which is commendable, or less commendable in my view, social justice workers in the sort of political activism. Just on the point of the girl you mentioned, who said that after that project she felt more connected to Judaism than she ever has before, and in general to those who see the Tikkun Olam movement and say, oh, this is a Judaism that I can get behind. It isn't Judaism. They are getting connected to things that they already believe in, things that they already value, things that they already do. In no way has the Judaism and their encounter with Judaism changed them in any way. They're just, what is the difference essentially between doing that in a non-Jewish context and doing it in a Jewish context? You mentioned earlier that in some of these programs they'll start. What makes it Jewish is they start off with Torah study and they start off looking at Torah text and so on. But the texts that they look at have been cherry-picked in order to justify or appear to justify the work that they're about to do. It isn't an honest encounter with the texts. This isn't actually changing people. And Farshad mentioned your TED talk that you gave. I'm one of the 1.3 million people who's watched it. And I enjoyed a great deal of it, particularly at the beginning. And one point particularly struck me when you said that religion is hard. Religion is hard, and it's actually something that Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik also has talked about, and I 100% agree. Religion is hard, and if we come out of our encounter with Judaism being exactly the same as we were before we started, and come out believing exactly the same things as before we started, and come out doing exactly the same things as we did before we started, then we haven't really had an encounter at all. And that Judaism, that religion, sounds very easy to me.
So let me ask you both to answer one question, and then I'm going to open it up. Because I have asked this question of many people, and I have generally not received a satisfactory answer. I want to know what political, social, general position you take, despite the fact that you as an individual don't believe in it, but because the tradition mandates it, so you take that position. And you say, I, as David Wolpe, would do this, but I know that Judaism insists that I do that, so I do that. Does the Torah, in fact, ratify everything you already believe, or is there something that you sacrifice of your own position because you believe that the tradition overrides your own perception? And I'm happy to start with either one of you who wants to answer. It's a hard question. It's a very hard question. First off.
So look, again, on that, to a degree, I would refer back to the answer that I gave before, that I don't think Judaism mandates a great deal of politics. I think people are free to have the politics that they want in a diaspora country, in the United States or elsewhere. That actually Judaism doesn't necessarily have an opinion on a great deal of political matters, and people can be for high taxes or low taxes. They can be for fracking or against fracking, and it's not necessarily the case that Judaism has an obvious policy point to make on these things. But if we're going to think about it, then I would say on something like the environment, for example, I think that Judaism's teachings on on the environment and about tashchit and the importance of not wasting, I think are, speak very strongly to the importance of recycling and being careful about the world around us. Absolutely. Does that mean, is that the same thing as basically saying that we need to overhaul all of our, overhaul Western economies for the sake of the environment? Not necessarily, but I think in our day-to-day lives we make an effort not to waste things that we consume.
I note more in sadness than in anger that you did not answer the question. I want to know what position you would take, but you don't because of, would you normally, you personally as Jonathan Neumann, you don't like recycling? You're in favor of waste, but the Torah tells you you have to recycle and you can't waste? I want to know, where does the Torah override your personal?
Well, I mean, this is the thing, when you've done this, and this is something I think, all of us sort of agree, when you do this sort of thing for a time, it becomes increasingly difficult to differentiate, because if you are trying to engage with the tradition properly, then the positions you take are ones that you think are in harmony with that. But yeah, I mean, why should I care about the environment if I'm not commanded to? Why should I? I mean, I need to,
Kids, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, future generations, next-door neighbors.
What about them?
Well, you're talking about why should you care about them at all?
Well, I'm saying that Judaism values the commandment above all else. So the point is that if you can be in a situation where you feel that you're commanded to do something as opposed to a situation where you're not, then obviously you want to put yourself in that category. It gives you an opportunity to fulfill a commandment, which is the highest calling of the Jew. So if I can conceive of myself as fulfilling a commandment by protecting the environment, absolutely I'll go for that.
Rabbi?
So first, let me say that I reject the premise of the question as well.
What is the premise?
Well,
that you reject.
I'll tell you. I became a vegetarian when I was 12 years old, and I became kosher when I was 19. And in rabbinical school, one of my colleagues told me that my kashrut was illegitimate because I had already ruled out the most delicious of treif items, and therefore I was no longer tempted by them because of my morals, not because of my commitment to God. So when we would walk up Broadway to get to the seminary, he would walk into Mike's Papaya to inhale the scents of the non-kosher meat, and then see if he could make it out the other side without buying and eating one. But I would walk to the other side of the street, wanting to have nothing to do with Mike's Papaya because the smell of the meat made me ill. So he felt that meant that he was observing a higher level of kashrut than me. So I don't believe that we can really gauge our commitment to God or connection to our tradition based on only whether or not it goes against our natural human impulses. If we were to do that, I would turn us once again to Musaf. I know my friend Rabbi Aryeh Cohen, who's cited many times in this book, would bring us to something like Second Day Yantiv. There are many ways in which the day-to-day life that I live, raising 3 kids and trying to get them out the door as a working mom and putting on tefillin and davening every morning is not exactly easy. There are many ways in which my sense of commandedness is profoundly inconvenient. Does it violate my sense of norms? Of what the values and norms are that guide me? I don't think so. I mean, if you ask me what are the ways in which Torah it differentiates from the platform of the Democratic Party, which I know is also a favorite question, and I think you allude to in the book as well. That's a different question, but I don't believe that our religious observance is only legitimate when it calls us to do something that violates one of our core senses.
I just want to say, in all fairness, I didn't say it was only legitimate if it did that. I was just curious whether there was anything that overrode what you would think of as your normal. I would normally really believe this, but I understand that the tradition tells me otherwise. But okay.
Before we go to questions, I just
and yes, well, I'm going to give you now free space before we go to questions to both say if there's something you haven't had a chance.
So I just want to say I really hear and appreciate your read of our tradition. And I'm totally fine with the fact that at your Passover Seder, you are engaged in an entirely and strictly particularistic exercise. in which you are recounting a story that happened at a certain moment in history. Some rabbis might disagree on whether or not it happened. I personally like to live in the light of that experience, as if I myself were there. I'm fine with your Judaism. I wonder why you're not fine with mine. Because I mean this very seriously. I understand that we're a varied and beautiful tradition. There are Jews from all around the world. There are Jews who disagree on so many things. And I'm not working to invalidate your Judaism. And you are actively working to invalidate mine. And I can tell you that every day while you were writing this book, I was out meeting and talking to Jews and trying to help strengthen their connection to our tradition, to our Jewish people, to our heritage, and to our core purpose, which you might not feel is a legitimate purpose, but is actually about bringing more love and more justice to the world. So I'm curious why that's so threatening that you would take the time to write this book. And I understand this sounds harsh, and I really mean it with all due respect, but it's hard for me to understand why that young Jew from Avodah, or why many of the people in this room would pose such a profound threat, that it would actually be so worthy of your time. There's so many really serious dangers facing the Jewish people today. As you well know, anti-Semitism is really on the rise all over the globe. There's poverty and hunger and disease and war and division. I'm just not sure why Jews who observe in a slightly different way than you, or Jews like me who also believe that there's a particularist element to our Exodus story and then expand to see the universalist implications, are such a profound threat to your understanding of Judaism.
Thank you for that. In a sense, I think that obviously we have very different perspectives on not just the content of Judaism, but I think more profoundly, you make reference to my Judaism and your Judaism. I come from a point of view where there isn't a my Judaism and your Judaism. There is a Judaism. That Judaism is rich and it is layered, but it is not just whatever we want it to be. It is something that is distinct from ourselves. And the reason that I'm brought to write this book is not necessarily different from some of the motivations that you cite. I am absolutely concerned about Judaism and the direction of the Jewish community. Assimilation rates in the Jewish community, as I said, particularly in denominations that seem particularly committed and dedicated to Tikkun Olam. And you also have to remember that you go out and your peers go out and speak in the name of your Judaism, or in the name of Judaism, in the things that you do, as you profess. But in doing so, you're also speaking for me, because you're not just speaking for your Judaism, because, as I said, I just see a Judaism. So when you go out and speak for your Judaism, you're speaking for all of Judaism for me. And I have a problem with that, because you're saying things on behalf of Judaism that I don't think are what Judaism actually says. So of course, I take, great umbrage and at that, and interest in that, and I feel a duty to try to disabuse Jews who believe that Tikkun Olam is Judaism, and particularly young Jews who believe that Tikkun Olam is Judaism, and believe that social justice work, that left-wing politics is Judaism, and feel themselves encouraged to become hostile or colder or distanced from Israel under the guise of doing Judaism, which is so wrong.
Also, Jews do criticize each other sometimes. Sometimes, not often, not like about the Exodus. Thank you. But sometimes they do. Okay, we have time for just a couple of questions. Farshad is pointing. Yes, the man with the mic. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Kurt Byron. I wanted to try and get a little more clarification about the terms we're using.
As we know, within our tradition, justice and charity are two very, very important notions, carefully, methodically developed, discussed throughout Torah, throughout Talmud. Certainly with respect to justice, don't favor the rich, don't favor the poor. Now we have this idea of social justice. It's not justice, it's not charity. It's different. What exactly is it? Is it conflating the two? Is it enhancing one or the other? Or is it confusing the two?
Okay, can we get a definition of social justice?
I'll tell you a story. There's a really terrible case study that's brought in a lot of social work schools, which some very sick person came up with, but is actually very helpful. So here's how the story goes. Many of you know this. So you're out on a hike and it's a beautiful day and you're hiking up the side of a mountain and you pass by a pool of water that seems to be at the bottom of a waterfall. And you look to your side and see that in that pool of water is a baby that's about to drown in the water. And you say, oh my God, a baby's drowning, and you jump in the water and grab the baby, right? And just as you finish saving this baby's life, you turn your head again and you see that now there's another baby in the water. And you jump in the water again and you save another baby. And then it happens again, and then it happens again. At some point you say, why are these babies falling down the waterfall and landing in this pool of water? Maybe I should run up to the top of the mountain and see who's pushing babies off the side of the cliff or whatever. Now, doing so means leaving the babies that are going to continue to fall there while you go up to the top. And so you're in a dilemma, right? Because you can't not be there to save the babies and pull them out of the water, but you also know that there's a systems failure here. And so this is how we understand the difference between social action and social justice, okay? The idea is that there are problems that are happening in our society which we can address in a very immediate and localized way, or we can take a step back and look at the root causes and try to understand what it would mean to build a society in which children aren't falling off waterfalls and landing in pools of water and hoping that some nice person is there to pick them up. And so social justice is a systems approach to understanding where the pain points are in our society and doing what we need to do in order to rectify those problems so that we can alleviate human suffering.
I think that's a terrific exposition, and I would say speaks to what I said earlier about social justice being a political ideology, because essentially what you have is saving the babies. That is the compassion, that is the grassroots efforts, or the charity, or whatever you want to call it, or social action even. And that absolutely Judaism mandates for Jews and non-Jews. It is once you start talking about the source of the falling babies, the systems approach and the systems failure, that's when you start talking about politics. And different people are going to have different views on how to stop the babies falling. And the question is, does Judaism take a position on that? And I think for the most part in the contemporary United States, Judaism doesn't take a position on that. And when we start saying that it does, that becomes very problematic.
Someone has the microphone over there. Go ahead. Yes.
Would you like to pick, Rabbi?
Would I like to pick? Oh, God, I would not. Go ahead. Whoever, yes, in the glasses, right there in the back. I'm sorry, I already picked that. I'll get you next, and then we'll take. Go ahead.
I have to say my heart is pounding, so I'm going to bear with me. Do you have children, Mr. Freeman? No. Okay. I have 3 daughters. I am a Brazilian Jew. I am a descendant of Holocaust survivors, 3rd generation. I sent my kids to Jewish school, and then when they became teenagers, they really, after their bat mitzvahs, they felt very disconnected. They were not interested. I really had to figure out very creative and alternative ways to get them connected.
I don't want to interrupt you, Mary, but I do want you to try to get to a question as quickly as possible, so a lot of people are asked.
Sorry. But what I want to ask you is that after, so my daughter is now 25 and is connecting with Judaism through an organization that might not be an organization that you consider doing Judaism. So I just want to ask you, as a parent, would I go and tell my kid, you know, hey, you're not practicing Judaism the way you should? Or I'm going to encourage her to continue practicing Judaism as...
Thank you. So if her daughter goes to bend the ark, for example, would you say to her, what would you say to her? And she comes home and she goes, oh my God, for the first time, I've been in a Jewish organization that means something to me.
Look, I'm not going to give kind of specific parenting tips, particularly not when it comes to teenagers. But you know what I'd say in general, I think one has to think very carefully about what it is they're actually doing, and as I said before, what it is that they think they are being connected to. They think that they're becoming connected to, and something that they could just be doing in any other context that happens to be called Judaism is not Judaism. And if in certain individual circumstances it can lead to them becoming more involved in what I would call properly Jewish circumstances and doing things with other Jews, then, you know, hey, that would be terrific. But whether it actually happens, again, empirically, the evidence does not seem to support that. So I would, you know, suggest, monitoring the situation.
How much of the difference here, I'm curious, has to do with the fact that you're speaking to Jews who are in, saying that's not a way out. That is, you can't minimize your Judaism and practice that Judaism that is Tikkun Olam and think you're doing Judaism. You have to be more engaged. And you, on the other hand, are looking at Jews that are out and trying to give them a way in. Not only what you believe, but also just strategically. And I wonder if we aren't addressing essentially different audiences, because I don't know how much your message will resonate with someone who's completely disaffected, and how much your message would speak to somebody who was deeply raised in a particularistic culture of the kind that Jonathan is talking about. I don't know, but I wonder whether this is also an audience address question. Does that make any sense? Not completely, but somewhat. Because this question here just reminds us that your answer to her is not the answer. This book isn't what someone like that means, for example. Fair? Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Hey, this is for Rabbi Brous. I hope I have your name correct. So I'm someone who grew up in the ultra-Orthodox world. I grew up what you call yeshivish. I grew up yeshivish, and part of the reason that I left that world is because I couldn't reconcile a lot of what I was taught, both in like the extremely foundational texts, like the Bible, as well as some later texts that are now almost even more foundational to orthodoxy, like the Talmud and Halacha and whatever, with my personal ideology, and that I think you could find sources both on the right and the left. Like I have issues with a lot of what has to do with slavery and gender issues and mamzeros and stuff like that, as well as some like personal property issues. So I left, and now I'm traditional, and I have to reconcile a lot of that with my own Judaism. A lot of what you're saying is that your Judaism squares entirely with everything, with all the foundational texts of, it sounds like that's what you're saying. Now, I don't understand why you can't just say, my Judaism no longer reconciles with a lot of what is taught, not only in the Talmud, but also in the Bible itself. This is my newer Judaism that I have claimed and I'm working with, and that's that, and this is what I'm working with. As opposed to saying, Tikkun Olam, it's in the Torah, it's what I believe, and my social justice and my politics, essentially, are tied into all Judaism that precedes it.
Okay, thank you for the question. So perhaps I wasn't being clear, so I appreciate the opportunity to be clear. I don't believe that the Judaism that I practice squares perfectly and entirely with biblical Judaism or with rabbinic Judaism either. But I also don't believe that we made it up whole cloth because it's conveniently in alignment with the Democratic Party. So I do believe, as I said in my TED Talk, that our religious tradition contains the raw material to justify religious extremism, violence, and cruelties of all kinds. And I also believe that it contains the raw materials to justify a life of love and compassion and the pursuit of justice. And I believe that each of us has to make a choice about how we read and how we engage our tradition. I can tell you that I can't even remember what happened, but something happened, some particularly atrocious moment in American history in the last 2 years happened. And on Friday night, we had a really feverish, beautiful davening experience, and I said something about what was going on in the country and how it connected to that week's parsha. I don't remember exactly which one it was. Frankly, there have been a few of those moments recently. And someone came over to me afterwards and he said, Rabbi Brous, I was really moved by the service tonight, but help me understand something. How do you know you're right? Because someone could read the same parsha and justify the exact opposite political position. So how do you know you're right? And I said, I don't. Maybe I'm wrong, but here's the thing. I know that if I'm wrong, if God is furious at me for fighting for love, and for fighting for justice, and for fighting for poor people to be able to get chemotherapy when they're dying from cancer, right? If God really doesn't want that, even still the world's not a worse place for me fighting for those things, because some people are gonna be able to get the health care that they need, right? If God really wants kids separated from their parents and thrown in cages, okay, then I don't think that we are worse off as a human community, because there are a number of people of faith in this country who actually believe that as much as I yearn for my children and want to be with them, that everybody should be connected and able to be with their own families and their own children. So I don't believe that the only way to read our tradition is my way. I know that, Jonathan, you seem to believe that, I mean, you said many times, that's not what Judaism is. That's not what Judaism is. You seem to know what Judaism is. Our tradition is so rich and so varied and so internally contradictory. I don't know that Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan agreed on what Judaism is. I don't know that our tradition pretends to be only one thing, but instead puts forward a number of ideas, and we, the living Jewish community, get to decide how we're going to live in the world as long as we hold a fidelity to our tradition. So I don't say, forget it, this doesn't work for me, I'm going to ignore it. I sit, I wrestle. It wasn't easy for me that the first line of Parshat Mishpatim talks about the ownership of slaves, just only a couple of months after the Israelite people have been freed from slavery themselves. I don't pretend it doesn't exist. I talk about it, we wrestle with it, we struggle. I don't believe that what our tradition often teaches about women, about homosexuals, about so many things is the right read, but I wrestle with it, and I try to find a way to live in the light of our tradition nevertheless. I go back to core teachings, like human beings are created in the image of God and therefore have fundamental human dignity, are born with inestimable worth, that every one of us is equal and that we are all unique in the eyes of God. I go back to kind of core principles, that Abraham was chosen by God because he was a person who was awake enough to see that the world was on fire and believed that it was partially his responsibility to partner with God and help put out those fires. So I don't believe what I'm engaging is made up. It is rooted in our tradition, but it's not that every single piece of our tradition is in alignment with the way that I practice, or frankly with the way that Jonathan practices, and probably not even with the way that Rabbi Wolpe practices.
Does it give you pause? A simple yes or no, I'm just curious, that the most learned and observant segment of the Jewish people tends to be the most right-leaning politically?
Yeah, I think that's something that we really need to contend with, and it's part of the reason that I'm so happy to see a resurgence of Torah study. I mean, just this past week we had
what to attribute it? I want to know, what do you attribute that fact? That the most learned and observant segment of Judaism tends to be the most right politically?
Because it's the most insular community. The people who are sitting in the Beit Midrash 14 hours a day learning Torah are not engaging with Black preachers and with Muslim colleagues and with co-workers at the, look, especially if you're not going to work, by the way, which is, maybe a particularly Israeli problem in this moment. And by the way, something that now many people in the Haredi community are talking about in Israel. If we are not in proximity with people whose lives are really different from ours, then it's very difficult to cultivate a kind of empathy toward their experience. So I think the more insular we are, the more we're engaged with Torah and Torah only in the Beit Midrash, the less we're actually encountering other human beings and expanding our hearts toward them.
I think one thing that I kind of generally struggle to understand, I'd be interested if it can, if you can clarify it, is that you talk about, on the one hand, that Judaism is very rich and varied, but also that you don't subscribe to all, and you say this yourself, that you don't subscribe to all of the kind of biblical or rabbinic conceptions of Judaism, and it's kind of your Judaism and so on. And it's kind of what I don't understand is that from my perspective, it looks like you have particular political positions and preconceptions and prejudices, which are fine. This is, we live in a democracy and everyone is entitled to their opinion. But I just don't really understand why they need to drag Judaism into it. If you yourself are saying that you don't subscribe to all parts of Judaism and therefore that you are, in effect, I mean, using the term cherry picking is a bit harsh, but in a sense, taking the parts that you like, the parts that you don't like, why do you even bother with the parts that you like? Why don't you just pursue the politics you want to pursue and just leave Judaism aside?
Because this is also my inheritance. You're not the only person who inherited Torah. I did too.
But you are saying yourself that you're rejecting part of your inheritance.
And so are you.
Everyone cherry picks. Everyone.
I mean, Jonathan, you must acknowledge you are also making those choices. I mean, you don't have to acknowledge it, but I'll acknowledge it for you. That every Jew alive in the world today is making choices about how she or he wants to live in a
There's
Torah.
one difference, which is the sociological difference between being a revolutionary and being a criminal. The difference is you can acknowledge the legitimacy of all the halakha and not do it all. That makes you a criminal. Or you can say certain principles no longer apply. That makes you a revolutionary. I think it's fair to say that the liberal movements of Judaism tend to be, in this sociological distinction, revolutionary, and the traditional movements tend to think of themselves sometimes as criminals. So there is some distinction, even if it's only an intellectual one, to be made between the way that liberal and non-liberal movements approach the tradition, even if not always the way that they practice it.
My own clarification, that would be that on a movement level, there's the revolutionary element. I would say for the traditionalist Jews, that the criminals are the individuals. Obviously, from my point of view, the more traditionalist denominations are not themselves criminal.
Allow me to just say that Rabbinic Judaism is a revolutionary movement. That when our rabbis chose not to stone children to death because they were stubborn and rebellious, that was a rebellion against Torah. And they did it in order to make Torah live. And so I would say that in fact being a revolutionary is very much in line with what our tradition has always called us to be.
This is a much longer argument, but it's a longer argument. Okay, one more. Go ahead.
I'm different than every...
No, you have to use the microphone.
Okay, I'm different than every single person in this room.
So is everybody else.
No. Yes, you're right. I was in China. I grew up in China during the Second World War. I was in, well, whatever you want to call it, Hangzhou. From personal experience, I know what it is, anti-Semitism. I also know that the only thing that saved us was Israel. And if you remember, what are the last 3 words for Passover? You made such a big deal of Passover. What are the last 3 words you always say? No, I'm asking her.
Shana haba b'Yerushalayim.
Yes, what does that mean?
It means next year may we be in Jerusalem for this
Exactly.
Yes.
Now, I grew up...
Okay, one second. You have to ask your question.
My question, well, this is the question, is I grew up that family came first.
Okay.
Family was family, Israel was family.
Okay.
Neither of you guys mentioned, you're talking about this poor person and that poor person. Nobody ever talked about Israel. And what I know is from your liberal point of view, Israel is not important.
Actually, you don't know that. Why don't you let her speak for herself? Okay, but thank you very much. First of all, in all fairness, Jonathan did mention Israel, and Rabbi Brous was not asked about it. So who wants to take this first? Do you want to go first, or do you want to actually say that Israel matters to you?
I mean, I think that assumption is exactly part of the problem. This is the straw man argument that we believe that there are serious Torah Jews who learn Torah, who daven, and who love Israel and love the Jewish people, and all the rest of us are just a bunch of activists who may as well be non-Jews. And that's, frankly, it's insulting to all of us. And it's diminishing of the Jewish people. So I mean, if you'd like to know my Israel credentials, I can tell you that my brother and sister both made Aliyah. My brother still lives there, married an Israeli woman. My nephew and nieces are all growing up in Israel as Israelis. I go twice a year. We're very happy to be able to bring our community over there whenever we have been able to do so. My daughter goes to an Orthodox high school here in Los Angeles, and two of my kids go to Sinai Akiva, and you know that these are serious Zionist institutions. I shouldn't have to really offer my Israel credentials, but I do so in order to only point out that this is exactly part of the problem, that everybody assumes that we know exactly who the other person is and isn't, and frankly, I believe that we are diminishing ourselves as a people by doing that. I want to make one other point, which is, I noticed that you didn't talk about Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. It's kind of a glaring omission in your book. I think you quote him once, and you quote him criticizing Tikkun Olam. So, by the way, this was the first time I said Tikkun Olam. I don't really talk about Tikkun Olam because, to me,
You don't believe in Tikkun Olam?
I don't know, to heal the world. I think it's interesting that the primary targets of your criticism are almost all conservative and reform rabbis. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks gives as powerful and pointed a defense of Tikkun Olam and social justice, Judaism, as any rabbi that you'll find in the reform or conservative movements. He's also British, you might have heard of him, and wrote a book with a very similar title to yours, To Heal a Fractured World, which is essentially a counter-testimony to what you've written here. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the reason that you didn't talk about Rabbi Sacks, who really weakly puts out his statements in defense of a Judaism that's not so dissimilar from mine, is because it's much harder for you to argue against someone who's not a straw man. Because it's really easy to say that this Jew that doesn't care about Israel and that only cares about politics and doesn't daven 3 times a day and doesn't observe Shabbat. I walk several miles on Shabbat in the pouring rain whenever it rains here. And I also care a lot about social justice. So I believe that it's very difficult for you to reconcile the possibility that someone can be both progressive and universalist, that someone can be both a very serious and learned Jew and also care that the hotel workers need to be paid a living wage and believe that our Judaism actually has something to say about treatment of the poor in this country. And I offer that to you really as a question. I would love to hear if I'm arguing with that.
I'll say very briefly, I think you and I read Jonathan Sacks very, very differently. I think Rabbi Jonathan Sacks would largely agree with my thesis, and he even says that he is incredibly concerned, he writes that he's incredibly concerned that Tikkun Olam has replaced not only Judaism, but even God in the lives of many, I should say, American Jews, particularly in the Tikkun Olam movement. So I think Jonathan Sacks is, if anything, on my side, but I'm not him, so he can say for himself if he pleases. The only thing I would say to the lady's question, I absolutely agree. Israel is by far and away the most precious thing that the Jewish people have. We have to do our absolute utmost to protect it. It's not necessarily all-consuming, but it absolutely has to be our number one priority as a nation. And as a final plug, I'll say that I do talk a great deal about Israel in the book, which is available for sale at the end of the sale.
So we would like to thank both of our wonderful guests for this. And your next talk. Thank you very much. I also would like to thank you, all 3 of you, on behalf of the congregation. My head is spinning. I'm walking out with more questions than I walked in with, but it certainly did not disappoint. Thank you very much. I want to thank you also for coming. Dinner is being served as you exit the door to your left.
Hi, Jimmy. You know what? It's a rush. He's Thank you, I'm not the only one. He swallowed so much of his words.
Rabbi, do you want to pick a time to get together now, or is it better?
I don't have my calendar.
Okay, and I didn't email you yet.
It has to be next week.
Okay, sounds good. What did you think?
Well, this is fabulous.
Yeah.
But I've had problems in Tikkun Olam as the direction of Judaism. I don't know that it's substitutes.
Yes.
That's not good.
I've enjoyed your drashes, as you know. When you give my Shabbat word.
Thank you.
It's really nice.
Thanks, Gary.
Hi, Barbara.
I was looking for the book and I don't see anybody selling it.
Let's go.
Oh, Jean?
Left, right,